and welcome back to the Big C Church podcast. I am excited to have a guest that is new to me. A lot of them so far have been folks that I know and have agreed to have conversation with me. My guest today is Jayne Wilcox. Jayne is coming to us. I'm from my office in Denver, and she's coming from a little alcove in her home in the Poconos right now in Pennsylvania. Jayne is by training a theologian, but has also, by experience, been a ministry leader, pastor, has taught theology, church history, Christian history in general, a variety of places. And so she also has a website called Girls Talking Church and a podcast called SHEcclesiology. So her whole specialty and nerd domain, like mine, is ecclesiology. And so I'm excited to have her here. So Jayne, thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Well, so like I said, right before we hit record, we're going to talk about the thing we love to nerd out about, and we're going to hit and we're having it recorded so others can listen in on us talking about this as ministry leaders and people with a heart for the local church and kind of the universal or Big C church. But I want to start just with, let's talk about understanding and definition, because church is a loaded term. So, what is the church? You say I teach ecclesiology, and you say I teach about the church, and people go, "What is the church?" Do you have a succinct answer? What would you say? Or let's talk around that.
Yeah. I think when we talk about church, and it depends on your tradition, it depends on your denomination. So I think there's a technical definition for church, but I think we could say that church is community. Kingdom community, I think, is even better nuanced definition of what it means to be the church. And then as we branch out from community, or this community committed to kingdom values, then we can talk about other structural definitions or technical theological definitions of church. But I like community. That works for me.
Okay. But you, just in the course of that, you mentioned a couple different things. So when you first said community, I go, well, I'm in a Bible study, or I'm in a workout group, a running group. That's community. So is that church?
Yeah.
Let's keep teasing here.
Yes. Yeah. For me, and I know that I don't like to say for me, because that's just so individualistic and not fair.
You should say in your understanding.
In my understanding, what I'm comfortable with, yes, that's church. I think it depends on what we're doing. If even as we gather around a pub table, as we gather around a sewing group or a quilt group, or a Bible study, I think begins to define it a little bit more. But could church be those communities? Yes. I think it's a matter of what we are tending to as we gather.
Okay, so that leads into what the other thing you said. You said community, and then you said kingdom community. But then you also clarified and said community committed to kingdom values.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I said all that.
You did, yeah. So now I'm going to hold you to it. So
okay.
No, keep unpacking. So you said it depends on what they gather around. So keep going.
So from my perspective,
your understanding, sure.
From my understanding, to be the church as a gathered community is this sign and symbol of the not yet kingdom. I keep piling stuff on.
I know, and we're going to go to all of them. So there you go. Okay. You're giving me plenty.
The already not yet kingdom on earth.
Okay.
And so we reflect that. We reflect that kingdom that's yet to come. Do we do it perfectly? Absolutely not. And we could probably gather many stories of folks where the church, the people, have not lived up to the expectations of being the reflection of that the kingdom on earth. But I think that's what we're called to. I think it's what Scripture calls us to. If I go back to, could we gather anywhere around any pub table or sewing group or Bible study, it's because, are we tending to the kingdom in being the kingdom in some way? And so if we're studying scripture, sure. If we're participating in ritual, of course we are. But I also think we can gather around a pub table and be about kingdom values. Are we welcoming? Are we being hospitable? Are we loving? Are we generous? All of these values of the kingdom. And when I say yes, lots of people can be generous, lots of people can be loving, but the kingdom calls for something outrageously generous, outrageously hospitable. And then we begin we stand out to the rest of culture, that there's something really unusual about those that are gathering around this pub table. They are outrageously generous, outrageously loving, outrageously hospitable.
So I'm going to keep teasing the threads because you keep giving me such good stuff. So you talked about several times, you said it's a gathered community. So,
Yeah.
and we'll get a little bit later, we'll talk about structures, right? So
yeah.
What does gathered mean?
That's a great question, in that because it's a bit of the hot topic post-COVID, isn't it? What does it mean to be gathered? Do we have to be embodied? Do we have to show up in person? From my understanding, yes, we do, because there's an embodied presence that we offer one another. And I don't think, did we survive COVID as disembodied, as gathering in Zoom or Facebook? We did. And again, I think it's according to tradition. Because if you're Catholic, or you practice the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, there is a deep fundamental lacking in not gathering in an embodied space.
Yeah. There was a Catholic church near me here in Denver that they started doing drive-in Eucharist communion, and so but it was very thoughtfully controversial as to, is that it was just so different, but you couldn't gather and celebrate and receive in the same way.
Yeah. Because you're taking a slice of, say, for example, the Catholic Mass. Yes, everything leads to the Eucharist. That the entire worship, the Mass service leads to that. And so while you're still participating in the Eucharist by drive-in, drive-through.
I think it was drive-through. Like, you could drive up in your car and people with masks would serve you, I think.
Yeah. There's still something lacking in it, even in the drive-through Eucharist. From so many other traditions where the real presence is not central to how we gather or why we gather. I mean, obviously the theology of the Eucharist is certainly why we gather. I think their value, and it's contextual. It's so contextual because it's what we needed to do for COVID, and I think it was still pleasing to God. At the end of the day, He is pleased with those who gathered the way they could gather, and for the loving sake of protecting one another. Right, we were still able to be the church in a way that was pleasing to God. For me, I really struggle. I get it. I understand. And even today, so it seems that there are certainly enough churches that are continuing, while they gather in person, they still have this virtual way for people to sit in, gather with them virtually. And I understand that too. And I think that there's a ministry in that. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. I think, and part of it is just how I think about how I would do church. Which is really my threshold, I think as you're picking up on, my threshold for what it means to be the church is low in the sense of, by all definitions of the institutional church, I lower that standard pretty far, I think. And so I think that's my struggle in that,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah. What I've, the term I've heard, and probably you as well, is kind of what's the ecclesial minimum.
yeah, yes,
And
yeah,
so I'm hearing from you. You're saying it's a church if it's embodied, gathered. There's some intentionality around kingdom values. I'm curious what
mm,
you would say are kind of the ecclesial minimum of those values.
yeah,
And where worship, or the reformed brothers and sisters would talk about where the gospel is rightly preached and the sacraments are
yeah,
rightly
yeah,
administered. So yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Keep talking through your ecclesial minimum,
yeah,
and because like you said,
sure,
tradition plays into this, and you're coming from an
absolutely.
Anabaptist, much more
Yes.
decentralized understanding.
Yeah, certainly. So let me share with you how I've me, my husband, my family, we've been a part of a church family um, for the last 12 years or so, 12, 13, 14 years.
Yeah,
um,
please.
which we are, and we were part of that church while we were in the suburbs of Philly. And so we're in the middle of relocating. But while we were there, and I pastored at this church for the first 5 years, and then I stepped away to do some doctoral work. Um, and what happened with that? And it was a small church. There were about 25 of
Okay.
us when I stepped away. And in their process of looking for another pastor, um, they very organically began doing church without a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I stepped away for about a year before I returned. My family continued there. And part of my stepping away for that year period, because I had been pastor, is that we needed to switch in our understanding of
Yep.
roles,
Yeah.
right? And so I had to step away from that community for a while and then re-enter. And they've quickly forgot that I'd been
Yeah.
pastor, which was a blessing.
Any notion of indispensability gone.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. um, and so they organically did church differently. So instead of gathering in the sanctuary worship space, there is what we call the cafe. We call it the back porch, to that sanctuary with the pews and the stage and the pulpit. Though I didn't really ever have a pulpit. Um, and so they gathered themselves around the cafe table for the kids, and kind of all squeezed in, and they would do really three things, sometimes four. They would gather, and inevitably 3 or 4 families would bring some kind of munchies, morning munchies. It could have been as elaborate as we're having a Sunday breakfast, hot foods, casseroles, fruit.
Yeah. Made to
Uh,
order omelets, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. We get out the waffle makers, so we're making waffles. I mean, the whole deal. To someone brought some apples, and another guy would always bring brownies, and we would munch on those. And we would gather at 10:30-ish, became the joke,
Yep.
because lots of, a handful of folks would roll in at 10:30, but then there was the perpetually late folks, 10:40, 10:45.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because we didn't start at 10:30
Yeah.
anyway.
You're just eating your
What we
waffles.
did,
Right.
we're eating waffles, and we're just talking. We're catching up on our week, what would have been people have been up to. And we would talk probably for a half hour, if not 40 minutes,
Yeah.
while we're munching and eating, until someone finally called to, well, shall we pray?
Yeah.
And then, we would be in a kind of a circle, and the kids are still with us, from the smallest to the teenagers. And we would just talk about, what do we need to be praying about? Who do we need to be praying about? What's going on in our lives? And that would be another 30 minutes or so. And then we'd settle in and we'd begin praying for those things. And then we'd all take a break because now we've been there for like an hour and 15 minutes. And so we need to, someone needs to go to the bathroom, someone needs to adjust. At that point, the smallest kids would leave up to like 5th grade or so. And someone would take them out and do some Bible study at their level. And then we would open scriptures. And there was either a leader or a reader. And so we would pick a passage of scripture. Typically, we're systematically going through a book or something like that. And if someone was leading, and it could have been an adult, it could have been one of the teenagers, they had a facilitator sheet that would prompt us with questions, the same questions every single time. And that facilitator sheet very much looked like the process that a pastor would do in going through preparing a sermon. Someone would have a commentary, typically the IVP, background cultural commentary. And then we'd have 2 people read the same passage twice. Could be a teenager, could be an adult, usually a guy or a girl or something like that. And then the facilitator would help us work through these questions. It was this beautiful time of the community coming around the scriptures, reading together, making observations, and no one was allowed to give any sermons, because the temptation was great
to pontificate or
yes. And unfortunately, when a mystery family would visit, they would be like, "What is going on here? These people don't know what they're doing."
Right.
And they'd blur it out with a 10-minute sermon. When we get to the end of that, and all the way down to application, we'd ask the question, always the same 3 questions. What does this passage mean for us today as Christians in the world? What does it mean for us being the church in the world? And what does it mean for us personally? And people could cue off of any of those questions in terms of, what did you hear the Spirit speaking to you today? Which is the hardest part of giving a sermon, by the way, when you get to, when you get to the application, because you're contriving something and hoping you hit, it hits someone. But it is this beautiful, and it's very Anabaptist, in the community is gathering around the scriptures, and it is a communal interpretation. And we're listening, we're working through the passage together. We're listening to one another, one ear to each other and one ear to the Spirit, and how we're being prompted. And then the application is really so very personal. And then the 4th thing we would do, if it was, the first of the month or however that worked out, we would celebrate communion together. That was church for us. And it was 15 years later. It is very difficult for me to think about doing church in a more typical established church sort of way, where, and though when I do go to a typical church service, I do enjoy it. I enjoy the preaching. I enjoy the singing together, the worshiping together. But that's how I think of doing church. That so fits the theology that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Well, that of course raises a whole bunch of other questions that I want to follow up with. So to our friends, brothers and sisters who are in more either traditional or I can hear people saying, but who's the authority in this? Who gets to decide, right? So what do you do?
Who has the power?
Yeah, well, yeah, and sometimes it's even not just with that can be twisted sometimes as a desire for power, but then there is this legitimate question of, in the early church, there were creeds and councils. Someone still had to decide, and so what do you do with the authority question or issue? And this, I think we're getting into a little bit more into structures. I mean, you've described a particular less structured structure. So what do you do with the authority? Like, if somebody says, well, but if there's a disagreement in interpretation, who gets to decide? Or if there's church discipline, or you have to appeal to, what do you do with all that?
Yeah. A couple of thoughts, and so in my context, I think it's fair to say that there were, one of my roles as I returned to doing church with this group is that, I mean, I still had theological sway,
Yeah.
if you will,
Yeah.
right? And they would look to me when there were really challenges, when we'd read something that maybe the cultural background commentary wasn't really helping. That we'd still work that out in conversation, but there was a guardrail there.
Yeah.
I think that's fair to say that there was a certain guardrail. The other thing is being a part of a denomination. This is where it matters.
Yeah.
So folks aren't going completely rogue, that there is this larger umbrella that we share in together. And while, particularly in my tradition, in the Brethren Church, so that larger umbrella is really, there's a few things that they have oversight for. So ordination, as well as some more administrative details in terms of, these hubs and churches that are across the country as well as the world.
So what you described just a few minutes ago, that was under a denominational umbrella. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And there's local autonomy. There's limited congregationalism is what they call it. And so there's a lot of freedom in that, but there's also this larger theology that we're functioning out of.
Yeah.
That certainly it comes through me being a part of that group, but I pass that on. And so that's in place. And I think that's one of the, we poo-poo denominations a lot these days. Mm-hmm. But there's value in that, particularly in terms of there isn't, and it's not an ultimate authority, but it's a lens, it's a hermeneutic that provides some guardrails in the process of interpreting scripture, particularly at the local level. Of course, it's not foolproof, but many steps up from non-denominational groups and leaders, ministries, that they are the authority.
Yeah.
And I think there's some challenges in that.
Well, so back to the ecclesial minimum, is an authority piece a part of an ecclesial minimum for you?
That I've never been asked that question. That is fantastic. Yes.
And you may not have an answer off the top of your head, but that's what came to me as we were chatting.
I would only go back to the denominations.
Yeah.
And I would need to think that through in terms of other traditions.
Yeah.
Where, again, they are defined by the fact that they have a structure and that there is an authority structure, right? And so it's not about limited congregationalism. It is, you need to answer to your bishop.
Yeah.
That's very different, which is good. I mean, that's historically, biblically correct in some sense.
Yeah.
So great question.
Well, you talk with if you talk about with folks in kind of the more missional streams, it's very, they use a lot of language around movements, and movemental. And, in my work with organizational culture of churches and systems, at some point an organization, a movement can turn into an organization, which then needs some sort of structure, which then needs generally some sort of leadership, and I think it's the spectrum of where you fall on the line of how free flowing versus how structured.
Yeah.
You have that. Well, so, probably everyone who's listening right now, and you and I, we've been a part of so many different types of structures, and people can make the case when I'm reading a systematic theology text, people can make the case for, just an authority for a lead pastor, for elders, for deacons, for denominations, for bishops, all sorts of understandings. Structurally, some folks would, from certain streams, I mean, they would hold tightly to their structure, and, but is there a right way or structure? Or I think the flip side of that is, are there wrong ways, definite wrong ways? How would you answer that? What are your thoughts?
I'm super hesitant to say there's a right or wrong structure. Because because I think they have their place. They all have their place. I am, as I mentioned before, I am I'm very appreciative of Catholicism, and so much that Christianity has been afforded because of, speaking of structures, because of the structures of Catholicism. I think in a very big understanding of capital C church, or the big church, particularly in a postmodern world where boundaries and lines of understanding, they tend to get blurry, or in terms of the definition of what it means to be church, or denominations, which I think structurally we resist those definitions as well. Each of these pieces of the church that exist, the capital C church that exist, whether it's superstructured like the Catholic Church, or without much structure at all, which I think are movements, or even some of the non-denominational movements or churches, we need each other. In that tension that we've talked about, of the centralized structured church, that I think in some sense are guardians of the tradition over thousands of years, that do not allow us to quickly or chalantly redefine some of the core truths and values and beliefs at the very essence of what it means to be Christians. We don't get to redefine that in 10 years. Maybe, as we talk about Catholicism, they think in centuries, right?
Yeah.
Where something like the Brethren Church, this small Anabaptist pietist movement, thinks in terms of decades, right?
Yeah.
I will often equate it to the aircraft carrier versus the little speedboat. Aircraft carriers take miles, something like 7 miles to make a U-turn.
Wow.
They can do it in a mile, but everything that's on that flat deck will slide right off if you try to move or do a U-turn within a mile. And you have these little speedboats, denominations that can turn on a dime. And theologically, the historical theology there is not, it's not going to move the needle at all, right?
Yeah.
And so we need each other. They are both nimble and stable at the same time.
Yeah.
And I have such appreciation for all of those traditions that allow us to be this very unified, and we have a long ways to go in our unity, but also very diverse.
Yeah.
And that I wouldn't call either right or wrong, but we need both.
So
a very long, convoluted
no, it was
answer.
great. Yeah, lots in there. Well, so when I asked you at the start of this conversation, what is the church? You gave me what I would say is probably kind of a local church understanding, right? Gathered, embodied, missional. But now you talked about church as big C and universal. So talk about your understanding of that. So, and how those two relate. Because you use church in two different ways.
Yes. Yeah, I did.
And we tend to do that. I mean, that's why I think church, when I say what is a church, that, I mean, it means so many things, even with the two of us just in one conversation. Yeah. It's taken on multiple meanings.
The capital C church, the universal church, it is our, it is, it's what provides our stability, right? Our traditions that we hold that makes us stable. And I think so. I'm kind of sliding a little bit to the sociology part of the conversation. The value of the sociological value for sustaining what began as a movement that turned into a an organization, if I can even use that word,
Yep.
that eventually turns into the institution
Yeah.
of the church,
Yeah.
which we would not have today if it were not for something that structurally allowed the stability of that and the endurance of it through 2 millennia.
Yeah.
I was going to say something else about that, and I cannot remember.
I've had those moments.
Let's
see if it comes back while I jog
okay.
you with this question. So in kind of that local church and big C that you're talking about, so how do you understand what some people call the parachurch, or and what terms? How is that different? How does that relate to this local gathered embodied kingdom and big C rooted historical?
Yeah.
Is that church?
Ooh, another good question. Let me just say this, make my disclaimer. I don't, I haven't studied enough parachurch organizations, to say a whole lot in this.
But I bet you know I mean, you know the concept. We're all touched by it.
Yeah.
You and I, as we're recording this, we're getting to the end of the fall and toward Christmas, and well, in a month or two, and we're going to start getting solicitation letters from all sorts of parachurch organizations.
Yeah.
Right. Christian worship, all the things that, I mean, it touches our lives no matter what, even if we haven't studied it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is off the top of my head. This is my thought. It has historically pushed, whether it's the local church or the universal church, it has pushed us to stay on mission. And at a time, particularly in the more conservative evangelical understandings or traditions of the church, where we weren't really focused on the missional aspect of being the church. And so I think of, you could leave this out if you'd like, because I don't even want to say Samaritan's Purse, but there I did.
There you go.
But it pushes these conservative churches, denominations, to be on mission, to be about kingdom values, right? Where they wouldn't normally have. Now it's defined, it's this, category over here. We do that during Christmas, right? And so there are special occasions that we're being about mission.
Yeah.
Which I would rather, and it has happened in the last couple of decades, where we've pushed this idea of mission that we embody every moment, every day of that with our lives as we are being the church. Yeah. So I think that has really been a valuable piece of Christianity, certainly in American Christianity, that had a important and special place, maybe even a unique place, in how we did church probably for a lot of the 20s, certainly the middle and the latter part of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, so back to your local, embodied, that type of thing. So we talked about how we both have young adult sons. Mine in college was involved in a campus ministry, that category, yes. Right? And so they would gather weekly, on a Thursday night, I think, on a location on campus. They had baptisms. They would do the Lord's Supper. They'd have a teaching. They certainly had fellowship. Is that a church?
I think we need to ask the college kids. Is that a church?
Tell me more about that. Right? Keep going.
Because it is a kingdom community, and I'm speaking out of my experience. So my son, my 24-year-old, he went to Penn State, so he went to a secular university. Yep. He immediately got hooked up with, I think it was Crew, okay, which made no sense to me. But I supported him, and I think for him, a lot of it was the contrast in theology, which fascinated him. Those conversations he would have with his friends, and he has since graduated, but he has lifelong friends that he made through that organization. They met every week. There was only a handful of times that he actually went to an off-campus church on Sundays. So that was his church crew meeting on Thursdays, and I think they met another time during the week, or they go to football games. I mean, they did life together.
Yeah.
I just threw another phrase out there, getting myself in trouble. But that was that was church for him. That was his community. That was his spiritual community. He was fed. They did Bible study together. They did lots of other life things together. And I think he would say that was church for him.
Yeah.
Now, I will say this. So my son and I, we joke, because his first semester at Penn State, he was at a Thursday night meeting, and someone was speaking up front. And it just so happened they were talking about women in ministry, which they were not for it. And so I get that this text comes in on this Thursday evening. He's like, "Mom, there's this guy up front, and he just keeps talking and talking and talking at us." And I said, "I'm so sorry, son. We've ruined church for you." Because at home,
right, you had that.
We did church very differently.
Right.
But certain, that was his first semester, and he finally got settled in. But that was incredibly meaningful for him in those 4 years.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I go back to, and I think it's a contextual conclusion. Coming off of an understanding of church as institution that certainly our generation has inherited, and so there's still a part of most of my background, my ecclesial experience has been church as institution.
Yeah.
The Gen Z, they still will participate in it, but you're not going to get them to maintain the church's institution. They're not going to give to the church's institution. They are walking away from the church's institution. And so I think they're defining for us what is church for this new generation, that it doesn't look like church's institution. And I don't think it necessarily means it's the right way to do church or the wrong way to do church, but they're finding a way to do church.
They're certainly not tied to, there's less assumptions about forms and less commitment to that.
Yeah.
You said, when we were, I think before we hit record, you're talking about how the theology defines structures. Talk more about that.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, tell me how you understand that concept, because I think it's come out in our conversation where you're saying, my theology is your theology is Anabaptist, and you come from these traditions, and so you gravitate or would be bent toward these types of structures. So, but talk about more about that conceptually.
Yeah. So I think there are two concepts in there. And one, I'm going to just put a pin in. It's that we're using theology in the plural.
Okay.
Theologies. Okay. Which is still can cause a little trouble for some folks. They're not comfortable with that. And then in terms of structure, let me use an illustration. So when I was at Highland Park Community Church, still pastoring there, we were going to do a relaunch. I'd been there for 2.5 years or so.
Now, is this a more institutional form? This is not what you were telling me about, or this is?
Same place. Okay. But I had, when I first started pastoring there, I walked into a church that was of 8 well-retired folks. Okay. Great saints. But the clock was ticking on that church. So about 2.5 years in, me and the leadership team, we developed an idea to do a relaunch, move up to the structure piece of that. And so part of that relaunch was doing some work in the sanctuary, rejigging a few things, cutting some pews in half and reorienting them to make a like this round sort of gathering.
Yep.
And so there was a little pedestal in the center that was, like pulpit high,
Yep.
but it was this, little thing. And I would stand there and preach, if you will. And then, the rest of the congregation is gathered around me. And there was a candle in the center there. And now outside of that gathering pews was what we called the back porch, which was a cafe space. But as we gathered, people would sit back there as well.
Okay.
Even as I was preaching and we're worshiping. The how we structured that space matched our theology.
Yeah.
That there's this candle in the center who is Christ, and I'm preaching to this gathered community because we are a community by definition.
Yeah.
In the Brethren Church, that is the priority, to be that gathered community. And now, as some of the other folks in the neighborhood would join us, they would typically sit in the cafe space because they weren't quite sure what it meant to be this gathered community. And that candle and that scripture and this person speaking some sort of truth, they're like, I'm not sure about all this yet, but there's something intriguing enough for me to walk through the doors and sit in the back cafe space where I can just sit casually and I don't really have to sing. People won't know if I'm going to sing or if I'm not going to. So we structured that to reflect the theology of this gathered community, what we are gathered around Christ in the scriptures, or Christ who is the scriptures, right?
Yeah.
And yet we have this other interstitial space between the neighborhood, the secular world, and this kingdom community.
Yeah.
So that's when I have to admit, I love to play with this idea that our theology informs our structures. And I think, honestly, we do that without even thinking.
For sure.
I mean,
yeah.
we think about even some of the churches built during the Reformation, the size of the pulpits in Lutheran churches, right? Compared to Catholic Church, where the center is not the pulpit, the center is the Eucharistic table.
Yep.
Right? The structure, how we structure it, reflects our theology.
Yeah.
Catholic churches built after Vatican II, very different theology. Okay, not very different, but tweaking the theology is reflected in how Catholic churches are built today.
Yeah.
That fascinates me.
Yeah, and when you say theology, I think you mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you're talking about multiple facets of it. So what do we believe about humanity? What do we believe about even Christology, and
Yes.
what do we believe about ecclesiology, as far as the nature and purpose of the church? All those pieces put together. And
Yes.
I think you're right. We talk
Absolutely.
in my program at Denver Seminary. One of the very first classes our Doctor of Ministry students take is a class where they're kind of uncovering what their embedded, understood kind of theology is, because they could espouse some systematic thing, for a paper, but really,
Yes.
all of us we have these operating systems, whether we're aware or not.
That's great.
And so I think last question I want to go there with you is, if that's the reality, that theology, and I would agree, theology defines and shapes our structures, and it's all these facets of our theology and our understandings, assumptions, and beliefs. What does, Joe or Mary congregant, like you said, I think we don't even think about this. What should we be thinking about and asking ourselves? And not just those of us who are talking on a podcast or teaching in a seminary, like, what do we as members of the body, even playing field, need to think about more?
In general, like wide open field in general?
About this, if there truly is this like underlying theology to it kind of thing. Yeah.
Gosh, that's a good question. What do we need to think about more? I'm going to wrap that in with just things that I've been thinking about
Sure.
lately, particularly my own denomination, where our um, our history comes out of the wed of two traditions, Anabaptist and Pietistic theology. And probably not so unlike many. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily call ourselves evangelical, though it's the air that we breathe in American Christianity. Our history, I think, as American Christians has been to focus on the loving God piece of the command to love God and love others as yourself. And our theology always has reflected that, still does, very much so. But how much does our behavior and how we think about doing church reflect the other side of loving our neighbor as ourselves? And that's a bit of a nudge in another direction that certainly my tradition is thinking about and working at. But I think that, I mean, whether we're up front leading or we're sitting in the pews, the folks are going to take cues off of their leaders and their pastors and their seminary professors. How do we emphasize the other theology of loving one another? And again, in this outrageous kingdom sort of way.
Yeah.
And maybe, so it's the tension between the two. Yes, we love God, of course. And yes, we love our neighbor. We focused so much on this side of it historically that we may need to swing, and that makes people super uncomfortable, particularly in conservative denominations and traditions. But maybe we need to sit and dwell there for a while, abide in that other half of the command just as much as we have abided in the loving God part of that. Though you don't forsake one, right?
Yeah.
We honor and we observe both sides of that tension. So yeah, that's just where my head has been lately. And how do we do that? And how do we do that? I mean, you have to battle through the obstacles of people resisting doing that, which is wearisome.
Yeah.
And thinking through, how do you just get to it?
Yeah.
Start working on it.
Yeah. 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 Well, I am sure grateful for your willingness to come on and wrestle together through these, through these questions and kind of hash this stuff out. So, one last non-ecclesiological question. Yes. I've never been to the Poconos, which I think it's the same. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's it's the range that's the Poconos, the Catskills, the Appalachians, right? Mm-hmm. That's the same. So I guess I've seen the Appalachians, but I look out my window. Not this one, but another one. I can look at my house and see the Rocky Mountains. Tell me what you love about the Poconos.
I was going to say mountains, but
they still are mountains
between the Rocky. Yeah. They are.
Yeah.
I love nature. So in my other life, I was I actually went to college. I was going to be a veterinarian.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Do love animals. I love, domestic animals, wild animals, even human animals.
Yes, creatures. Yeah.
Creatures. All of God's creatures. So our mountain house it's up a mountain according to the Pocono Mountains. Right. So it's up a mountain, pretty steep mountain, sits back in the woods, and it's just quiet. And so I can go sit on the back deck and I can hear the birds. Occasionally I hear the hawks squeaking and squealing and probably finding lunch somewhere. We're also at the confluence of two rivers, so the Delaware River and the Lackawaxen River. And we'll often go on the river, either kayaking or something. But yeah, just nature in general. It's such a contrast from living in the suburbs of Philly. Yeah. So we lived in Levittown, which is one of the first pre-planned
Yeah.
communities,
Yeah.
living on something like 0.15
Your
acre
postage
postage
stamp. Yeah.
stamps. Yeah. It was a great place to raise kids, and we lived there for 30 years. Fabulous neighbors, just a great structured neighborhood to raise kids. But I think that's probably in our rearview mirror at this point.
Yeah. Well, you can invite me anytime to experience your place, and you are welcome to come to my hip urban pad here in Denver as well. So, Jayne, thanks so much for your time and for just challenging our thinking, and blessings on you and your ministry.
Thank you. It's been a joy. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And a challenge. All these questions were challenging.
I'm no apologies. Yeah. That's the whole tagline: challenging conversations to better the body. So you fit right in. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.